Bookmark. The scissors glinted ominously under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights lining the corridors of Emerald Creek High School. Students gathered in a tight semicircle, their whispers sharp and cutting through the air. In the center of it all, Officer Jared Cole stood, his uniform crisp, his expression as unyielding as stone. Before him sat a girl, frozen in her chair, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as he gripped a handful of her thick, coiled hair. "Maybe now you'll learn what respect means," Officer Cole spat, his voice echoing against the lockers. "You think you're above everyone else because of that little speech of yours in class? Well," he sneered, pulling the scissors close to her hair. "Let's see how proud you are now." Her hands trembled as they clutched the armrests of the chair. "Please," she stammered, her voice cracking. "This isn't right, you can't." But before she could finish, his hand pushed her back down into the seat. The sharp snap of the scissors reverberated through the hallway, and thick strands of her hair tumbled to the linoleum floor like feathers. The crowd gasped in shock, but no one moved, no one spoke. The officer leaned closer, his sneer growing colder. "No more attitude, no more thinking you can talk back. Maybe now, you'll finally learn your place." The humiliation burned hotter than the tears cascading down her face. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Around her, students whispered behind their hands, some stifling their shock, others gawking wide-eyed. Somewhere in the crowd, a teacher stepped forward tentatively. "Officer Cole, this is unnecessary," she said, her voice trembling. "She's just a child." He turned sharply, his voice booming with authority. "She broke the rules. This school has been far too lenient with this kind of behavior. I'm doing what needs to be done." The scissors snapped again, and another chunk of hair fell to the floor. The girl wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but her legs felt cemented to the chair. Her mind raced, her body paralyzed as the cruelty unfolded second by agonizing second. Then the front doors of the school slammed open. The heavy thud-thud of footsteps echoed through the hallway, each one louder and more deliberate than the last. The crowd parted, their whispers fading into silence as a man in a tailored black suit appeared, his FBI badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. The officer froze mid-cut, his eyes locking with the man's piercing gaze. "What are you doing here?" "This is a school matter," Cole said, his voice faltering for the first time. "No," the man interrupted, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is a federal matter now." The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as every student held their breath. The officer stepped back, the scissors trembling in his hand. "Step away from her," the man ordered, his voice low but brimming with authority. For a moment Officer Cole hesitated, but the authority emanating from the man was undeniable. With a metallic clatter, the scissors fell from his hand to the floor. The girl lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief and tentative hope, but her shame lingered. Hoshia? Her identity lay in shattered pieces around her. "You don't understand," Officer Cole stammered, his once commanding demeanor unraveling. "She was out of line, disrespectful. I had to." "You had to do nothing," the man cut him off, his voice icy and unrelenting. "You abused your power, and now you'll face the consequences." The once frozen crowd began to murmur. Phones emerged from pockets, recording every second. Officer Cole's face paled as the realization sank in. His authority was slipping through his fingers. The man stepped closer. His eyes were locked on Cole's, his voice trembling with tightly controlled fury. "You chose the wrong person to mess with." Cole opened his mouth, but no words came. He took a shaky step back as the man retrieved his phone and made a call. Within moments, more agents appeared at the school's entrance, their presence commanding and unyielding. The students stared, wide-eyed with disbelief, as the officer, who had just moments ago wielded scissors like a weapon, was handcuffed and led away. The murmurs grew louder. Some students looked away, unwilling to meet Cole's eyes. Others stared, their expressions a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. But the girl wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the man who had just stepped in to protect her. Her father, her shield, her protector. Her heart still raced with fear, but something else pulsed within her now. Hope. And yet, as the officer was escorted out, his protests growing weaker, an unspoken question lingered in the air. How far would her father go to ensure justice? And what would become of Officer Cole, now that the tables had turned. No one could have predicted what would come next. But her eyes weren't focused on the words scribbled on the notebook in front of her. Her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing silently, running through every pause and emphasis of the speech she'd planned to deliver later that day. This was supposed to be her moment. At the stove, Ethan Carter flipped a pancake with practiced ease while glancing at the news on his tablet. Ethan wasn't just any father. He was the deputy director of the Bureau of Investigative Operations, a man whose sharp instincts and discipline had built his reputation. At home, however, he made every effort to leave the hard edges of his work behind, especially for his daughter, Lena. She had inherited his unrelenting determination, his analytical mind, and most importantly, his refusal to back down. "You're unusually quiet this morning," Ethan remarked without looking up, his tone teasing but with an undertone of concern. "That's not like you." Lena glanced up from her notebook, attempting a smile that faltered almost immediately. "Just nervous, I guess. The whole school's going to be there. What if I mess it up?" Ethan set the spatula down and turned to face her, his expression softening. "You've practiced this 100 times. You're ready, and no one in that auditorium knows more about this topic than you do." He leaned in slightly. "Own it," she nodded, trying to absorb his steady confidence, though her stomach remained a tangled knot of nerves. This wasn't just a speech. It was a statement. Lena's presentation would focus on systemic injustice and the complexities of identity, topics she cared about deeply but knew were polarizing. The school had offered her this platform, but not everyone wanted her to use it. A buzz on her phone pulled her from her thoughts. A text from her best friend Rachel lit up the screen. "Good luck today. Don't let them rattle you." Rachel's words offered some comfort, but Lena knew there were others who wouldn't be as supportive. She'd overheard whispers in the hallways, caught sidelong glances from certain teachers, and above all, felt the piercing tension whenever Officer Dane Harlow was nearby. Officer Harlow had been stationed at West Ridge High School as a resource officer a few months earlier. With his broad shoulders, towering presence, and stern demeanor, he commanded attention wherever he went. But it wasn't just his presence that unsettled people, it was his demeanor. Harlow had a habit of singling out certain students, always the ones who spoke out, looked different, or didn't conform to his expectations. Lena had clashed with him before. He didn't appreciate the way she asked questions, nor her willingness to push back. After she had challenged him during a discussion about police conduct in class, he had warned her to watch her attitude. The tension between them had only escalated since then, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that today might be no different. When Lena and Ethan arrived at the school parking lot, it was already bustling. Clusters of students milled around, some holding handmade signs and banners in support of her presentation. Others lingered on the sidelines, their expressions guarded. Ethan parked the car, his gaze scanning the crowd before turning to her. "Call me if anything happens," he said firmly. It wasn't a suggestion. "I'll be fine," Lena replied, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel. But as she stepped through the front doors, her heart pounded against her ribs. The auditorium buzzed with energy. Rows of chairs were filled with students, teachers, and even a handful of parents. Near the front, she spotted Rachel giving her a thumbs up, and she tried to focus on that rather than the anxiety curling in her chest. After a brief introduction from the principal, Lena was ushered onto the stage. She gripped the edges of the podium, her palms clammy as the microphone emitted a low hum. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of panic within her. "Today, I want to talk about identity, how it shapes us, how it defines us, and how it's often challenged in ways we don't expect." She glanced at the crowd, catching glimpses of encouraging nods and a few skeptical crossed arms. But identity isn't just personal, it's political, it's historical, and sometimes it's weaponized against us. Murmurs rippled through the audience, but Lena pressed on. She shared examples, statistics, and personal anecdotes that painted a vivid picture of systemic injustice. By the time she finished, the room was alive with tension. Some students clapped enthusiastically, while others sat stiffly, arms crossed and lips pursed. And then Officer Harlow stood, his voice sliced through the air like a blade. "You think you're oppressed? That you're some kind of victim? Let me tell you something, young lady. You don't know the first thing about real struggles. Gasps filled the room as Harlow strode toward the stage, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Lena's pulse quickened as she fought to hold her ground. This kind of talk divides people, he said, his voice low and pointed. And you're not going to do that in my school. I have the right to speak, Lena replied, her voice trembling but resolute. Not anymore, he snarled. Before she could react, his hand gripped her arm, dragging her toward the edge of the stage. Phones shot up in the crowd, recording every second of the confrontation. Her voice cracked as she protested, but Harlow wasn't listening. His iron grip pulled her into the hallway, away from the murmuring crowd. There, his tone darkened further. You think you can say whatever you want without consequences? He spat, his face inches from hers. You need to be taught a lesson. You need to be put in your place, Officer Harlow growled, his voice low and seething. Lena's breath hitched. You can't do this. You're out of line, she protested, her voice trembling as panic set in. No, you're out of line, Harlow snarled, yanking open a nearby drawer and pulling out a pair of scissors. The cold metal glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. He held them up for all to see, his glare fixed on her. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The cold steel grazed her scalp, and Lena's world tilted. A rush of nausea and disbelief washed over her as she sat paralyzed. Students gathered at the doorway, their faces pale with shock. Some shouted for help, but their voices were thin and tentative, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. No one stepped forward. Then, suddenly the front doors to the school burst open with a forceful slam. The silence that followed felt even heavier than the tension that had filled the air just moments before. Harlow's grip on the scissors faltered. His hand trembled slightly as his eyes darted toward the source of the disturbance. At the entrance to the hallway stood Ethan Carter. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His sharp, commanding presence filled the space, freezing everyone in place. For a moment, time seemed to stretch infinitely. Lena's breath caught as her father's piercing eyes locked onto hers. She could see him take in the scene, the strands of her hair scattered across the floor, the terror etched into her face. Her stomach twisted, and she wanted to run to him, to let him fix everything. But something about the way he stood, rigid and controlled, with an anger simmering just beneath the surface, made her stay frozen in place. Harlow broke the silence first. You can't just barge in here like this, he said, his voice defensive, but the edge of his usual confidence was gone. This is a school matter. Ethan raised a hand, and Harlow's words died in his throat. His voice, low but lethal, cut through the thick air like a blade. Let her go. Harlow's fingers twitched, then loosened. Lena stumbled out of his grasp, her legs wobbling as she stepped away. She didn't fall, but she felt unsteady as if the ground beneath her was shifting. Ethan's eyes never left Harlow. What do you think you're doing here? Harlow blustered, attempting to sound firm, but the crack in his voice betrayed his nerves. This girl has been out of control, causing disruptions, stirring division, disrespecting authority. Someone had to. Someone had to what? Ethan cut him off, his voice sharp and unrelenting. Humiliate her? Assault her? Cut her hair in front of her peers? She was disrupting the order of the school, Harlow shouted, straightening his posture in a feeble attempt to regain control. His hand hovered over the radio clipped to his belt. I did what I had to do to maintain discipline. No, Ethan snapped, taking a step closer. You abused your power, and now you're going to answer for it. The hallway filled with murmurs as the crowd of students grew, their phones raised, capturing every moment. Harlow's face turned red as the weight of the eyes on him began to press down. You're making a mistake, Harlow hissed, stepping back. You think you can just come in here and take over? I've been keeping order in this school since before you. This isn't about rules, Ethan interrupted coldly. It's about you, your ego, your prejudice, your abuse of power. You thought no one would stop you because you thought no one could. Harlow's eyes flicked toward the crowd, then back to Ethan. His breathing quickened. You don't scare me, he muttered, though his voice wavered. You should be scared, Ethan said, his tone quieter but more menacing. Not of me, of what comes next. Lena's stomach churned at her father's words. There was something in his tone she hadn't heard before, not just anger but finality. The static crackle of Harlow's radio broke the suffocating silence. His hand instinctively reached for it, but Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Harlow could hear. "If you think this ends here," Ethan murmured, "you're wrong." Harlow's hand froze, and for the first time, Lena saw doubt flicker in his eyes. It was brief, though, as he clenched his jaw and straightened. "You don't have jurisdiction here," Harlow said through gritted teeth. "Not anymore," Ethan replied, stepping back and pulling out his phone. Without breaking eye contact, he began to dial. "This is Ethan Carter. I need agents on site for immediate detainment and investigation." Harlow's face paled, his bravado crumbling. "You can't." "I can," Ethan interrupted sharply, "and I will." The tension in the hallway thickened as students whispered and phones continued recording. Lena's heart raced as she watched the confidence drain from Harlow's face. It wasn't enough, not yet. She wanted him to feel the shame he had tried to force upon her. "You really think this is going to end well for you?" Harlow spat, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you can make this about race and walk away clean?" "This isn't about race," Ethan said evenly, his gaze flicking to Lena before locking back onto Harlow. "This is about consequences." Harlow's hand hovered near his belt, but Ethan didn't flinch. The tension was suffocating. The two men standing inches apart, each refusing to back down. Then, in the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Harlow's defiance faltered, as his eyes darted toward the end of the hallway. The color drained from his face. Ethan leaned in, his voice low and final. "It's over." The piercing wail of sirens echoed through the air, and Harlow's face fell, his composure crumbling like a fragile facade. Lena's heart raced, her gaze darting between her father and the officer who had moments ago tried to strip her of her dignity. The atmosphere shifted as the weight of what was unfolding pressed down on everyone in the hallway. Harlow took a shaky step back, his hands trembling as the first group of federal agents entered the building. Ethan Carter didn't move. He stood firm, his eyes locked on Harlow, unyielding and calm, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Despite the sirens, the cameras capturing every moment, and the growing crowd of students whispering and staring, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Something deeper, something bigger, was about to erupt, threatening to shatter every illusion of control Harlow still clung to. The tension in the hallway grew heavier, vibrating off the walls. Every sound, the shuffling of shoes, the buzz of whispers, the metallic click of handcuffs locking around Harlow's wrists, seemed amplified. Harlow stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly as the agents flanking him moved with precise authority. Their expressions were unreadable, their uniforms crisp and commanding. But Harlow's attention wasn't on them. His eyes darted repeatedly toward Ethan, who stood just a few feet away. Shoulders squared, Ethan radiated a quiet power that demanded silence. His words cut through the thick atmosphere with the precision of a blade. "You thought no one would stop you," Ethan said, his voice calm but laced with fury. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted to whoever you wanted without facing any consequences." Harlow opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter a word. "No more excuses," Ethan said, his tone hard as steel. "No more lies, no more hiding behind that badge." Harlow's shoulders tensed, his jaw tightening as though he was trying to hold himself together. "I was doing my job," he said weakly, but the conviction in his voice had evaporated. "She was out of control, disrespectful. Someone had to..." "Someone had to what?" Ethan snapped, taking a deliberate step closer. His towering frame made Harlow instinctively lean back. "You didn't step in. You crossed the line. You humiliated a child in front of her peers. You tried to break her." Harlow flinched, but forced his voice to rise defensively. She needed to be put in her place. Someone had to stop her from spreading hate and division. Hate? Division? Ethan's eyes burned with controlled rage as he gestured toward the students gathered in the hall. Phones were raised, capturing every second of the confrontation. "Look at them. Look at her." He pointed to Lena, who stood behind him, her face pale, but her eyes locked on Harlow with a steady defiance. "Does she look like the one spreading hate, or do you?" Harlow's eyes flickered with something close to panic, but he struggled to maintain his footing. "You don't understand the pressure in this school," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate cadence. The rules are falling apart. Kids like her think they can do whatever they want, say whatever they want. Kids like her, Ethan repeated sharply, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. You mean the kids who don't stay silent? The ones who stand up for themselves? The ones who refuse to let people like you push them down? Harlow's face flushed red, his lips tightening. But before he could respond, Ethan pressed on. You didn't do this to enforce rules, Ethan said, his voice cold and unyielding. You did this to send a message, and now I'm sending one right back. The crowd shifted uneasily, the murmurs growing louder as the agents stepped closer, their hands firm on Harlow's arms. Ethan's voice dropped to a low, lethal whisper that only Harlow could hear. You thought no one could touch you, that you were untouchable, but you made one fatal mistake, you crossed the wrong person. Harlow's breath hitched, his eyes darting nervously toward the agents as they reached for their radios. He tried to pull back, but Ethan leaned in, his voice calm yet brimming with finality. Don't fight it, Ethan murmured. It's over. No, Harlow hissed, his voice trembling now, his hands balling into fists. This isn't over. You can't just come in here and tear me down. I've given years to this job. I've earned this position. Ethan's jaw tightened, his unwavering gaze locked on Harlow. You didn't earn it, you abused it. Harlow's voice rose again, desperate now as the agents began reading him his rights. You're going to regret this, he said, his tone low and sharp. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made, Ethan replied steadily, was not stopping you sooner. The crowd surged closer, phones still recording. The students that whispers turned to quiet gasps of disbelief. Lena stood at the edge of it all, her breath shallow as she watched the man who had humiliated her only moments ago now standing there, his hands bound in cuffs. But as much as she wanted to feel relief, it didn't come. Not yet. Harlow's voice broke through the hum of murmurs. You think this ends with me? He spat, his words dripping with venom. You think this school doesn't back me? You think this town doesn't stand behind me? Ethan didn't flinch, his voice was calm, unshakable. Let them, he said, because after today, everyone will know exactly who you are, and so will they. Harlow's breath quickened, his defiance flickering like a dying flame. You don't scare me, he muttered, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. You should be, Ethan replied softly. Not of me, but of what's coming next. The sound of sirens grew louder, closing in from the distance. The color drained from Harlow's face as the reality of what was happening began to settle. Lena clenched her fists, the tension in her chest twisting tighter. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. These parents, these teachers, they'll stand with me. They'll fight for me. Harlow spat, though his voice wavered. Lena felt her heart twist painfully at his words. But Ethan Carter didn't flinch. His tone was steady, his words cutting. Let them, he said, because after today, everyone will know exactly who you are, and so will they. Harlow's breath quickened, but his bravado was crumbling, his words losing their edge. You don't scare me, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Ethan leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper that sent shivers through the air. You should be scared, not of me, but of what's coming next. Harlow opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. Before he could muster a word, the agents began leading him down the hallway. The echo of his boots scraping against the floor seemed to fill the silent corridor as the crowd parted, their eyes following him like shadows. Some students whispered, their voices hushed with disbelief. Others stared in silence, their faces pale and unreadable. Lena's gaze remained fixed on Harlow until he disappeared through the doors. When he was gone, Ethan turned to her. His expression softened as his eyes met hers, and he stepped closer. You're okay now, he said gently. It's over. But Lena shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No, it's not. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, concern flickering behind his composed exterior. What do you mean? Lena swallowed hard, her chest tightening under the weight of everything left unsaid. It wasn't just him, she said finally, her voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. The teachers, the staff, everyone who saw what he was doing and let it happen, they're still here, and they're still letting it happen. Ethan's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as her words sank in. But he didn't interrupt. He didn't try to reassure her prematurely, he simply listened. They knew, Lena continued, her voice rising with the anger bubbling to the surface. They saw him harassing students, humiliating them in the hallways, and they looked the other way. Or worse, they defended him. They told us to respect him, to follow the rules, to stop causing problems. They let him do this. Ethan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but Lena barely felt it. The words kept pouring out, faster and hotter. And when I finally spoke up, they made me feel like I was the problem. Like I was making things worse, just because I wouldn't stay quiet. And now he's gone, but they're still here. They're still letting it happen, and no one is going to stop them. Ethan's voice was calm but resolute, grounding her just enough to keep her from spiraling. We will stop them, he said, conviction ringing clear. Not just him, all of them. Lena opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted. Principal Garrison appeared, his face pale and drawn, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. His tie hung askew as he approached, his movements jittery, like a man teetering on the edge. Mr. Carter, Garrison began, his voice thin and strained. We need to discuss what just happened. This situation. It's complicated. Ethan turned to face him, his sharp gaze cutting through the principal's flimsy composure. The situation, Ethan said, his voice razor-sharp, is already being handled. Garrison hesitated, visibly flustered. He straightened his tie in a futile attempt to regain some semblance of control. Handled, he echoed weakly. There are protocols, procedures we need to follow. We can't just... Protocols, Ethan snapped, his voice rising. You're talking about protocols now? After you let that man terrorize students in this school for months? After you stood by while this happened to my daughter? Garrison's hands shot up, palms outward in a defensive gesture. No one wanted this, he said hastily. But we can't just rush into accusations. The school's reputation. The school's reputation? Lena's voice cut through the exchange, trembling but fierce. She stepped forward, her eyes burning with anger. That's what you're worried about? She demanded. Do you have any idea what it felt like to sit there while he cut my hair? While he humiliated me in front of everyone? Do you know what it feels like to be treated like you're nothing, like you're the problem, just for existing? Garrison's mouth opened, but no words came. They saw what he was doing, Lena continued, her voice cracking with emotion but unwavering in its force. You saw it, and you let it happen. You defended him, and now you want to protect the school's reputation? Ethan stepped in beside her, his presence formidable. She's right, he said, his voice cold and unrelenting. You knew, and now you're going to answer for it. You and everyone else who let this happen. Garrison's shoulders sagged under the weight of their combined words. He took a shaky step back, his voice faltering. I need time to figure out how to handle this. You've already had time, Ethan shot back. Too much time, and you wasted it. Lena stepped forward again, her voice rising with renewed determination. You didn't protect us. You protected him, and now you're worried about protecting yourself. But what about the students he hurt? What about the ones who didn't have anyone to stand up for them? For the first time, Garrison's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He looked at her, his face etched with guilt and fear. But Lena wasn't done. Do you even know what it's like to sit there and feel powerless while someone strips away your dignity? She asked, her voice trembling but strong. I'm not the only one he did this to. And you let it happen. Ethan's voice followed hers, low and steady but no less cutting. And now you're going to cooperate with the investigation. Every file, every report, every email. And you'd better start preparing yourself for the fact that, when this is over, you may not have a job anymore. Garrison swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I need to call the school board, he stammered before turning and walking away hurriedly. Ethan turned to Lena, his voice softening. You okay? She shook her head. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I will be. Ethan nodded, though she could see the tension still lingering in his eyes. He wasn't done. Neither was she. The hallway felt both heavier and lighter now, the echoes of what had just transpired lingering like the first rumble of a storm. But for the first time, Lena wasn't afraid of what came next. Handled, Ethan Carter repeated, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. Or did you somehow miss Officer Harlow being escorted out of here in handcuffs? Principal Garrison swallowed hard, his eyes flickering nervously between Ethan and Lena, whose trembling anger was palpable. Yes, of course, he stammered, his tone thin, but there are protocols we need to follow. Procedures. Protocols? Ethan's voice sliced through the principal's attempt to regain control. You want to talk about protocols now? After you let that man terrorize students in your school for months? After you allowed him to do this to my daughter? Garrison raised his hands defensively, palms outward, his voice growing more desperate. No one wanted this to happen, but we can't just rush into accusations. The school's reputation. The school's reputation? Lena's voice broke through, trembling but razor sharp. Garrison flinched as Lena stepped forward, her voice rising with every word. That's what you're worried about? She demanded, her tone tinged with disbelief and fury. Do you have any idea what it felt like? Sitting there while he cut my hair, while he made me feel like I was nothing? Do you even know what it's like to be treated like you don't belong? Like you're the problem, just because you exist? The principal opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Lena's voice cracked, but she pressed on. You knew what he was doing, she said, her words shaking with anger. You saw it, and you let it happen. You defended him. You let him use his badge as a weapon. And now you're standing here worried about the school's reputation? Ethan stepped in beside her, his voice unyielding. She's right, you knew. And now you're going to answer for it. You, and every single person who let this happen. Garrison took a shaky step back, his voice faltering. This isn't what it looks like. We didn't know it had gotten this bad. You knew, Ethan interrupted, his voice dropping lower but no less lethal. You knew, and you did nothing. And there's already an investigation, not just to Harlow, but into this entire administration. Every ignored report, every student who felt unsafe, every excuse you made to protect him. Garrison's eyes widened, his voice breaking. You can't. I already did, Ethan cut him off with cold finality. The principal's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he took another step back. I need to call the school board, he mumbled, his voice shaky. Ethan didn't stop him. He simply watched as Garrison turned and hurried away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lena's chest heaved as the reality of what had just happened settled over her. Her heart pounded, her mind racing. She looked up at her father, her voice quiet but trembling. What happens now? Ethan's gaze remained steady, though heavy with the weight of everything yet to come. We keep going, he said. We make sure no one ever goes through this again. Lena nodded, but her thoughts were still spiraling. She knew there were more people like Harlow out there. She had seen them, felt their stares, heard their words, and for the first time she wasn't afraid to fight back. The hallway slowly began to empty, but the tension in the air refused to dissipate. Lena stood near the edge of the room, her hands still trembling despite the weight that had lifted when Harlow was taken away. Relief hadn't come. Not yet. Her thoughts twisted and tangled, replaying the moment again and again, the way students had stood frozen as Harlow humiliated her. Some had recorded it, their phones raised like shields, but none of them had stepped in. That silence lingered in her mind, the kind of silence that made her feel invisible. Ethan stayed close, his presence steady but sharp. Lena could feel his thoughts were elsewhere, already moving toward the next battle. And she wasn't done, either. The sound of hesitant footsteps brought her back to the moment. Garrison reappeared, his steps sluggish, his shoulders hunched like a man walking toward his own defeat. He didn't look directly at Lena, instead addressing Ethan, his voice thin and brittle. I've spoken with the school board, Garrison began, though the nervous quiver in his voice betrayed him. They're concerned about the optics of all this. We need to manage the narrative carefully. Ethan's eyes snapped toward him, cutting off his words mid-sentence. The narrative? Ethan's voice was sharp, each word a weapon. You think this is about managing optics? This is about accountability. You let this happen under your watch, and now you're worried about appearances? Garrison swallowed hard, his tone defensive. I'm not trying to make excuses, but you have to understand, there's going to be fallout. The media is already outside. Parents are calling non-stop. If we don't control this... You don't control anything anymore, Ethan interrupted, stepping closer. His voice dropped low but firm. Not after today. Your first concern should have been the safety of your students, not your reputation, and the fact that it wasn't is exactly why this investigation doesn't stop with Harlow. Garrison's face drained of color. An investigation? You can't seriously? I already have agents reviewing records, Ethan said without hesitation. Complaints filed, reports ignored, disciplinary actions swept under the rug. This isn't just about Harlow. This is about the culture you allowed to thrive here. Garrison's mouth opened to protest, but no words came. His face crumpled and his shoulders slumped under the weight of the moment. For the first time, Lena saw real fear in his eyes. This isn't just about Harlow, Ethan said, his tone cutting through Principal Garrison's flimsy attempts at defense. This is about the culture you allowed to fester here, the culture that let him operate unchecked, that made him believe he could get away with this. And the more you try to deflect, the worse it's going to look for you. Lena watched as Garrison's shoulders sagged under the weight of Ethan's words, but she felt no sympathy, not even a flicker. What happens to the teachers who supported him? Lena's voice broke the tension, sharp and direct. The ones who turned their backs or made excuses. Do they get to stay? Do they get to pretend like they didn't know what he was doing? Ethan turned toward her, his expression softening slightly, but Lena wasn't finished. I don't want this to just disappear, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I don't want them to walk away and act like it never happened, because if they do, nothing's going to change. Garrison opened his mouth as if to respond, but Ethan cut him off. It's not going to disappear, Ethan said firmly, looking Lena in the eye. I'll make sure of that. The principal took another hesitant step back, his uncertainty evident in the way his eyes flicked nervously between them. I need time to figure out how to handle this, he muttered. You've already had time, Ethan snapped. Too much time, and you wasted it. Lena stepped closer, her voice rising with conviction. You didn't protect us. You protected him. And now you're worried about protecting yourself. But what about the students he hurt? What about the ones who didn't have anyone to stand up for them? Garrison finally looked at her, his face crumpling under the weight of her words. But Lena wasn't done. Do you even know what it feels like? She asked, her voice breaking but fierce. To sit there while someone strips away your dignity? To feel powerless while everyone watches and does nothing? Her voice grew steadier. I'm not the only one he did this to, and you let it happen. Ethan's voice followed hers, sharp and cold. And now you're going to answer for it. Garrison's shoulders slumped. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. You're going to cooperate with the investigation, Ethan said, his tone calm but unyielding. Every file, every report, every email, and you're going to start preparing yourself for the fact that when this is over, you might not have a job anymore. Garrison opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked defeated, and for the first time, Lena saw real fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who knew the walls were closing in. Without another word, Garrison turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Ethan stepped closer to Lena. You okay? He asked, his voice quieter now. Lena shook her head. No, but I will be. Ethan nodded, though the tension in his eyes remained. He wasn't done. Neither was she. The sound of hurried footsteps brought them both back to the moment. Rachel appeared, her face pale but determined. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around Lena. Lena felt her shoulders drop slightly, the weight of the moment easing as Rachel's presence reminded her she wasn't alone. They're not going to get away with this, Rachel said softly. Lena nodded. Not this time. Ethan watched them, his sharp gaze softening at the edges. He reached for his phone and stepped away, speaking in low, deliberate tones. Lena knew what he was doing, ensuring that nothing and no one would sweep this under the rug. But as she looked around the now empty hallway, Lena's thoughts refused to quiet. She thought of the students who had stayed silent, the ones who had looked away, the ones who had cheered Harlow on while he humiliated others. This wasn't just about Harlow or Garrison or even the teachers who had let it happen. It was about everyone who had chosen to stay silent. Lena's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was determination. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The echoes of Principal Garrison's retreating footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost eerie. Lena's pulse hadn't slowed, her hands still clammy with the adrenaline of everything that had happened. Ethan stood nearby, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, sharp, each word carrying the weight of authority. Lena could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders squared as though bracing for impact. Rachel lingered beside her, her presence grounding Lena in ways that words couldn't. But even with Rachel close, Lena felt the heaviness pressing down on her, threatening to overwhelm her. Her eyes drifted back to the spot where Harlow had stood, his defiance crumbling the moment those handcuffs clicked shut. At first it had felt satisfying, but now it felt hollow. "You should sit down," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the haze. Lena shook her head. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I don't want to sit. I can't sit." Rachel softened her tone. "You're shaking." Lena glanced at her hands and realized Rachel was right. Her fingers trembled as if her body still hadn't caught up to the moment. She clenched them into fists, trying to force the trembling to stop. "I'm fine," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. Lena's voice caught in her throat, and Rachel didn't push her. Instead, she stayed close, her presence steady and comforting. "You don't have to be fine," Rachel said softly. "Not right now." Lena turned away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Her voice came out as a whisper. "I just keep thinking about how everyone watched." She swallowed hard, her words trembling. "They saw what he was doing, and no one did anything. Not one of them." Rachel stepped closer, her tone gentle but firm. "They were scared, Lena. Just like you were." Lena's voice cracked and the dam broke. "But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. And the worst part," her breath hitched. "For a second I thought he was right. I thought maybe I deserved it." Rachel's voice sharpened, cutting through Lena's self-doubt like a blade. "Don't you dare say that. Don't let him win." Lena's shoulders shook as she exhaled, and Rachel moved in front of her, forcing her to meet her eyes. "You didn't deserve any of this," Rachel said, her voice unwavering. "And you didn't let it happen. He did. And so did everyone who let him think he could get away with it." Before Lena could respond, Ethan's voice cut through their conversation as he ended his phone call and approached them. "They won't get away with it," he said, his tone steady but heavy with resolve. "The investigation is already underway. Harlow's going to face charges, and the school is going to answer for every single report they ignored." Lena looked up at him, her voice unsteady. "But what if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?" Ethan's expression softened, but there was still a fire in his eyes. "It will," he said. "It has to." Lena's stomach twisted, doubt gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She thought about all the times Harlow had looked at her like she was beneath him, like he had every right to put her in her place. She thought about the people who had stayed silent, the ones who hadn't stopped him. What if they were just like him? What if this was only the beginning? Ethan seemed to sense her unease. His voice softened. "I know you're scared," he said. "I know you're angry. You should be. But this doesn't end with him. It doesn't end today." Lena swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I just want to feel safe." For the first time, Lena saw a crack in Ethan's armor. It was subtle, the flicker in his eyes, the slight tremor in his voice as he replied, "You will." But it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a hope. The sound of voices down the hall pulled them back to reality. Teachers had begun to gather in clusters, their murmurs low and hurried. Their eyes darted toward Lena and quickly away again, as though avoiding eye contact might shield them from blame. "They're scared of you," Rachel said, leaning closer. Lena pressed her lips into a thin line. "Good." Ethan glanced back at her, his voice low. "This isn't over yet, Lena. You know that, right?" She nodded, her voice steadier this time. "I know." Footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder. And Lena's eyes snapped to the far end. A group of agents returned, their expressions grim and purposeful. One of them approached Ethan, speaking in hushed tones. Though Lena couldn't catch every word, she heard enough. "Reports are pouring in. Multiple complaints, documentation, possible negligence charges." Ethan's expression hardened as he nodded. "Make sure nothing gets buried," he replied, his tone sharp. The agent nodded back and disappeared down the hall, leaving Ethan standing there, his shoulders tense with the weight of what was unfolding. Lena stepped closer. "What happens now?" she asked. Ethan's eyes met hers, steady and sure. "Now we make sure every single person who let this happen answers for it." Lena's heart pounded. She wanted to believe it was that simple, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't be. The people who had allowed this to happen wouldn't go down without a fight. But neither would she. Rachel touched her arm gently. Whatever happens, you're not doing this alone. Lena nodded, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. I know. Ethan's phone buzzed again, and he stepped away to take the call, his tone sharp as he issued instructions. Lena looked around the hallway, taking in the faces of the teachers and students who lingered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some looked at her with guilt in their eyes. Others with relief that they hadn't been the ones in her position. Lena clenched her hands into fists, not out of fear, but determination. Rachel's voice was soft but steady. You're not done, are you? Lena shook her head, her voice resolute. Not even close. The hallway felt colder now, even as the buzz of voices grew louder. At the far end, teachers stood in tight groups, their whispers sharp and hurried. Some glanced toward her, then quickly looked away, as if eye contact might somehow pull them into the storm brewing around her. She stood still, her heart pounding, her thoughts racing faster than she could catch them. Ethan was still on his phone, pacing a few feet away, his words clipped and deliberate. The tension in his shoulders mirrored the weight Lena felt in her chest. Rachel stayed close, grounding her, but even that couldn't stop the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger, frustration, and something deeper, fear. Not fear of Harlow anymore. Fear of what came next. What if this didn't fix anything? What if the people who had let it happen slipped through the cracks? What if this was only the beginning? Lena clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as the thought twisted in her mind. What if the people who stood by and let it happen find a way to slip through the cracks? She couldn't let that happen. Ethan hung up his phone and turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, their intensity making Lena's pulse quicken. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating, until he finally stepped closer. I need you to be ready for what comes next, he said, his voice low but firm. Lena swallowed hard. I'm ready. For a fleeting moment, Ethan's eyes softened, but the moment passed quickly. This isn't over, he said. The investigation's moving fast, but it's going to get messy. People will start pointing fingers. They'll try to protect themselves, even if it means throwing someone else under the bus. Lena's stomach twisted. What if they come after me? They won't, Ethan said without hesitation. Not while I'm here. Lena wanted to believe him, but the shadow of doubt lingered. What about the others? She asked. The teachers who defended him, the ones who looked the other way? They're already being questioned, Ethan said, his tone measured. And if they had any part in what happened, they'll face consequences. Lena shook her head. That's not enough. Consequences don't fix what they did. It doesn't change the fact that they let this happen. Ethan's voice dropped, steady and heavy. No, it doesn't, but it's a start. Before Lena could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. You think this fixes everything? Lena and Ethan turned to see Mrs. Curtis, one of Lena's teachers, standing a few feet away. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, but the strain in her face betrayed her nerves. Lena's chest tightened. What's that supposed to mean? Mrs. Curtis's voice hardened. You think tearing this school apart is going to make things better? You think dragging everyone through the mud is the answer? Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp and cutting. Are you seriously trying to blame her for this? Mrs. Curtis flinched, but didn't back down. I'm saying this school isn't perfect, but what happened today didn't start with Harlow, and it's not going to end with him either. Maybe instead of burning everything down, you should think about what comes next. Lena's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her anger bubbling to the surface. What comes next? She snapped. What comes next is kids feeling safe. What comes next is people like you not turning your backs when something's wrong. Mrs. Curtis's voice wavered. It's not that simple. It is that simple. Lena shot back. You saw what he was doing. You saw how he treated people, and you didn't do anything. And now you're worried about the school instead of the people he hurt? Before Mrs. Curtis could respond, Ethan cut in. His voice was cold and firm. You're done here. Mrs. Curtis faltered, her face flushing red as Ethan stepped closer. You're part of the problem, he said, his words steady and sharp. And if you can't see that, then you don't belong here. Without another word, Mrs. Curtis turned on her heel and hurried down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Lena's hands were still shaking, but this time it wasn't fear, it was rage. Ethan turned back to her, his voice softer now. "I know this doesn't feel like enough," he said, "but we're not finished." Lena's eyes burned, but she nodded. "I know, and I'm not finished either." Rachel stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "You don't have to do this alone." Lena's breath hitched, and for the first time, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I know," she said again, this time with more certainty. The sound of footsteps filled the hall, and Lena turned to see a group of agents returning. Their faces were serious, their movements purposeful. Ethan stepped forward to speak with them quietly, while Lena and Rachel stood back, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Rachel broke the silence. "Does it feel real yet?" Lena exhaled slowly. "No, but maybe it doesn't have to." "Not yet." The agents disappeared down the hall and Ethan turned back toward her. "Come on," he said. "We're not done." Lena followed him, her steps heavier now but her head held high. She could feel the weight of every moment pressing down on her, but instead of crushing her, it felt like fuel. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance from the teachers, every uncertain look from the students reminded her why this couldn't end here. She didn't look back as they stepped out of the hallway and into the next battle. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with reporters, parents, students, and community members who had followed the case closely since the day Officer Harlow was led away in handcuffs. The weight of the room pressed down on Lena, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like fuel. She sat beside Ethan, who looked as composed as ever, though Lena could see the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of emotion behind his sharp eyes. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every student who had ever felt invisible, every voice that had been silenced, and every moment she had questioned whether speaking up was worth it. Across the room, Harlow sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. His face was pale and expressionless, the arrogance that once defined him now replaced with hollow resignation. The judge's gavel fell, and the room quieted. The arrogance that once defined Harlow was gone, replaced by something hollow and broken. Lena felt no sympathy for him, not after everything he had done, not after the stories that had surfaced during the investigation. Stories from students who had been belittled, targeted, and humiliated. Stories that had been silenced for years. Now, finally, those voices were heard. The evidence against Harlow had mounted quickly, and piece by piece, the facade he had built crumbled into nothing. The judge's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs in the packed courtroom. Guilty on multiple counts. The words were final, undeniable. For the first time since that day in the hallway, Lena let herself exhale. She didn't smile, not yet, but the weight that had pressed down on her for so long began to lift. Harlow's eyes flicked toward her as he was escorted out of the courtroom. But there was no fight left in them. No anger. No defiance. Only the hollow recognition of a man who had lost everything. Lena didn't look away. She wanted him to see her, unbroken. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder as the crowd began to disperse. His voice was steady, low. "It's done." Lena nodded, but she knew this was only the beginning. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone had expected. Teachers who had turned a blind eye, administrators who had buried complaints, patterns of discrimination that ran far deeper than anyone had dared to admit. Principal Garrison had resigned before the hearings even began, his name permanently tied to the scandal. Several teachers faced disciplinary action. Some were fired, others reassigned. But the damage they had caused wouldn't disappear overnight. Outside the courthouse, Lena found Rachel waiting for her. Rachel's eyes shone with pride, and something else, relief. She didn't say anything at first. She just pulled Lena into a tight hug, and for the first time in weeks, Lena let herself lean into it. "You did it?" Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena pulled back, shaking her head. "We did it." The months that followed were a whirlwind. Lena's story spread far beyond their small town, sparking protests, petitions, and policy changes. Schools across the district began implementing new training programs, stricter oversight, and stronger protections for students. Lena found herself at the center of it all. Interviews, speeches, meetings with lawmakers. At first, it was overwhelming, but as time passed, it began to feel like purpose. Harlow's sentencing was harsh, as it should have been. Assault, harassment, abuse of power. He would spend years behind bars, and when he got out, he would never wear a badge again. But Lena didn't spend much time thinking about him. She focused on what came next, on ensuring this didn't happen to anyone else. Principal Garrison faded into obscurity. Rumors swirled that he had tried to find a job in another district, but no one wanted his name tied to their school. Lena didn't feel sorry for him either. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Through it all, Rachel stayed by her side, reminding Lena when to breathe and when to fight. Rachel had been there when Lena felt like she was drowning, and she was still there now, helping her navigate the aftermath. And Ethan, he became more than just Lena's father. He became her ally, her advocate, her biggest supporter. Ethan had always believed in justice, but this time it was personal. He fought for it like his life depended on it. Lena knew she wouldn't have made it through any of this without him. Months later, Lena stood in front of a packed auditorium. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced the crowd. Students, parents, and teachers filled the room, their eyes fixed on her. Once, she had been afraid to speak up. Not anymore. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she began. "It doesn't happen because one person stands up and speaks out. It happens when we refuse to stay silent, when we refuse to look away, when we decide that enough is enough." The crowd hung on her every word, and for the first time, Lena felt like she truly belonged there. She wasn't the scared girl in the chair anymore. She was something else, stronger, braver, louder. After the applause died down, Lena looked out at the faces staring back at her. She wondered how many of them had stayed silent before, how many had looked away, how many would think twice before doing it again. This story isn't just about Lena, it's about all of us. It's about what happens when we let fear and complacency keep us from standing up for what's right. It's about the damage silence can cause and the power of speaking out. How many times have we seen something wrong and told ourselves it wasn't our place to step in? How many times have we let someone else's voice be drowned out because it was easier to stay quiet? But silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. And in the end, it's the people who speak up, the ones who refuse to be silent, who make the difference. So, what would you do if you saw injustice unfolding right in front of you? Would you be the one to step in, or the one to look away? Think about that the next time you see someone being treated unfairly. Thank you for watching Lena's story. If it moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Tell us what you would have done in her shoes, or what you think needs to happen next. And if you want more stories that challenge you to question, feel, and act, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Think about what it means to be a bystander. Ask yourself, are you willing to live with that choice? If Lena's story moved you, if it made you pause and reflect, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Lena's shoes? What do you think should have happened next? And if you're looking for more stories that inspire, challenge, and make you feel, be sure to subscribe to Voices Unheard for more impactful narratives. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.